My name is Nick Tebben. Thanks for showing up to my talk. Let's get started. Let me share the screen with you. All right, so I'm here from Towson University, and the topic of my talk today is beliefs and commitments in collective epistemology. So here's the idea. I'm going to argue that for epistemic purposes at any rate, group beliefs are better understood as commitments to the truth of a proposition and not as beliefs proper. So what do I mean by a commitment? A commitment is a normative status. It's not a psychological state. And it has the following characteristics. So those who are committed to the truth of a proposition are required to act and reason as though it's true. And in order to properly undertake a commitment, which can be it can be done improperly, but in order to do it properly, you have to have evidence that the proposition in question is actually true. So I'm going to argue that insofar as we're talking about epistemology, we shouldn't be focused on group psychology. We should be focused on the normative statuses of groups. In particular, the status that you acquire when a group undertakes a commitment to the truth of a proposition. I'm going to remain agnostic about whether or not groups have genuine beliefs, psychological beliefs. Now, I'm going to talk about group psychology, but it doesn't require commitment to the claim that there are such things as group beliefs. I'm going to have a conditional claim about what you have to believe if there are group beliefs. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to suggest that functionalism provides the best account of group minds. So if groups have minds at all, then functionalism is probably true. Now, it seems intuitive and obvious to me that if you're going to believe in group psychology, you're going to have to be a functionalist. But I'm still going to give you some reasons to think that functionalism would be an attractive commitment for someone who wants to think that that there is such a thing as a group psychology. However, groups and individuals, I'm going to argue, cannot manifest the same functional properties. So according to the functionalists, a mental state is a set of, or maybe not just the set, but the inputs to a mental state, transitions between mental states, and the outputs from that mental state. So collectively call those functional properties. And I'm going to argue that the functional properties that individuals can display are different than the functional properties that groups can display. So consequently, groups cannot be in the same mental states that individuals can. And in particular, they can't believe the same propositions. So I'm going to argue that what's believable for an individual is literally unbelievable for groups. So if there are such things as group beliefs, remember I'm going to be agnostic about that, but if there are, you should be a functionalist, and it follows that the things that groups believe are different than the things that individuals believe. However, it does seem that individuals and groups can know that the same propositions are true. This also seems obvious, but I'm going to argue for it when we get to it. But it looks like on the surface this is a problem, because individuals and groups can know the same propositions, but they can't believe the same propositions. And according to the traditional analysis of knowledge, knowledge requires belief. So the way out of this is to deny the traditional analysis of knowledge. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to suggest that knowledge requires commitment instead of belief. So it requires a normative status, not a psychological state. Then I'm going to give you some reasons that people might have did think, that it requires belief, and why it would be easy to confuse the commitment condition with a belief condition. So that's what we're up to. We're going to start off by talking about the metaphysics of group minds. So this is going to be the section where I suggest that if you're going to believe in group minds at all, you should probably be a functionalist. So one of the reasons to like functionalism as an account of group minds is basically one of the reasons to like functionalism as an account of individual minds. So for one of the main selling points of functionalism just all along was that it allows us to make sense of multiple realizability. So it does seem like very dissimilar individuals can nevertheless have similar psychological states, the same psychological states. So just as it's possible for me to feel pain, it should in principle be possible for a Martian to feel pain, or a computer to feel pain, or at any rate, if you want to set aside phenomenal properties, It should be possible for me to believe that it's raining, and likewise, it should be possible for a Martian to believe that it's raining, and likewise, it should be possible for a computer to believe that it's raining. And functionalism makes good sense of this, because if the belief it's raining is just a functional state of, in my case, an organism, then anything else that displays the same functional state has the same belief, be it a Martian or a computer or whatever. So, so functionalism makes good sense of the multiple realizability of psychological states. And we're going to need that if we're going to account for group minds, because groups are just wildly dissimilar from individuals. And so we're going to need, and so that we can make good sense of the idea that groups have minds just like individuals do, if we can say what matters isn't what the thing is made of or what's going on inside its brain. If we can say what matters as far as the mind goes is the function that it exhibits, so long as the group exhibits the same function that the individual does, we're good to go. It's also consistent with the idea that mental states arise out of the interaction of group members. And it seems like they do. And at least in some cases, it seems like the mental states of a group are not simply pulled out of the mental states of their members, but the mental states of the group in some way arise out of the way the members of the group interact with each other. And since the interaction of the group can be characterized functionally, or rather the interaction of the group members, the interaction of the group members could be part of what it is for the group to display a mental state. In an individual, the same function would be realized in something neurological, I suppose. But as long as we're characterizing mental states functionally, there's no problem with the idea that mental states arise because of how members interact with each other. Functionalism also implies that a group could have a belief that's not shared by any of its members. And that's good news, because a bunch of people have argued that groups sometimes do have beliefs that aren't shared by any of their members. And the way that functionalism implies this is, well, like we just saw, mental states can arise out of the interaction of group members, and the group members could interact in a way that instantiates a function that corresponds to a particular mental state, even if none of the individuals also display the same function. So that way, the group can have a mental state that none of its members do. And functionalism is also consistent with an array of leading views in the metaphysics of groups. We're going to see in a minute that functionalism does require the thing that displays the function to be grounded in the world and to interact with its environment in certain ways. And so if functionalism is going to be a workable philosophy of mind for groups, your metaphysics of groups has to admit that groups can have causal properties so they can interact with their environment. But a lot of the leading views on the metaphysics of groups do say that groups have causal properties. There are some views that identify groups with their members or with particular arrangements of their members. So the only views about the metaphysics of groups that functionalism is inconsistent with are those that deny that they have any causal properties. And there are a few of these. Some people argue that groups are sets, and so functionalism is not going to be consistent with that metaphysics of groups. But a lot of the leading views it is consistent with. And so functionalism seems like a very promising way to theorize about group minds. And in fact, I think that if groups have minds at all, the philosophy of mind that has to be right is functionalism. Okay. The kind of functionalism at issue, though, has to be wide functionalism. This is a term that Gilbert Harman started using back in the 1980s. And I'll explain it in a second, but that the functions have to be wide as opposed to narrow also explains why groups and individuals cannot share beliefs. So the idea behind functionalism is that mental states are functional roles, input relations, transitions between mental states, and output relations. But it was realized really early on that the input relations and output relations cannot be specified formally. They have to be given substantive characterizations. So as early as 1967, in his psychological predicates, Hilary Putnam argued that that the inputs to a mental system have to be sensory inputs, and the outputs have to be motor outputs. So as early as the 60s, Putnam was requiring that the thing with a mind has to have sensory access to its environment and has to be able to causally interact with its environment, to go on and shape its environment. There's a few reasons for that. One of them, perhaps like the most noteworthy, is that, well, besides the, so maybe the most noteworthy reason for thinking that we have to specify the input and output relations substantively is that all sorts of things can display a purely formal relation. So if the functional roles are just mathematical objects, you could have dripping water and cooling car engines and all sorts of things displaying the functional roles that would correspond to mental states. And it just doesn't seem very likely that dripping water and cooling car engines, or whatever your favorite example is, actually have minds. And so since functions that are specified purely formally can be realized in too many different things, if you give a substantive characterization of the input and output relations, you can just rule out all sorts of things that we intuitively don't want to include amongst the things with minds. But it didn't take too long to realize that Putnam's restrictions on what the input and output relations are was not strict enough. And so by the 1980s, Putnam himself and Gil Harman also said that the input and output relations have to make reference to the environment itself. So it's not enough to say that we need sensory inputs and motor outputs. The inputs have to refer to the actual environment, and the outputs also have to refer to the ways that you actually engage with the environment. There's a couple reasons for this that Harman talks about. Harman says that psychological explanations usually make reference to the environment around the organism whose behavior is being explained. And if it does, then the mental states of the individual the mental state that you're using in that explanation has to, the specification of the mental state has to make reference to the environment itself. And you need to make reference to the environment itself also to take into account semantic externalism. So in the 70s, Putnam and Burge and some other people argued that your mental content doesn't just depend on what's going on in your mind, it also depends on the actual environment you're interacting with. So if the sensory input, if the inputs to a belief about water were just sensory, someone who is on Earth and someone who is on twin Earth would have beliefs about water, but the whole point of the meaning of meaning and related work in the 70s was that they don't. In order to have a belief about water, you have to actually interact with water. So the input has to be not just a sensory input, but it has to involve actual interaction with water. So if you're gonna have a workable functionalist theory, it has to be that the input and output relations stretch out to the actual environment itself. They're not just internal things, and they're not just the way that the internal things react to the environment. It has to include the environment itself. Now, let's talk about an example of substantive inputs and outputs. So to believe that it's raining, for example, is in part for there to be some probability that you're going to take an umbrella when you go outside, given appropriate beliefs about umbrellas being around, appropriate desires about not wanting to get wet, and so on and so on. So like your behavior is going to be produced by a complex mass of psychological states. But from the functionalist perspective, part of the belief that it's raining is there being some probability, here's the output relation, that you're going to take an umbrella when you go out. The probability is going to go up or down depending on background beliefs and desires and so forth. But there has to be some probability you're going to take the umbrella when you go outside. Now, the reason that this undermines the idea that groups and individuals can believe the same propositions is that this is the sort of thing that individuals can do, but it's just not the sort of thing that groups can do. You and I can take umbrellas when we go out, but groups can't. And that would mean that groups can't believe that it's raining outside. They just don't have the right output in this case to display the function that, according to functionalists, just is the belief that's reigning outside. And given trivial modifications to the arguments, it means that they can't believe anything else that individuals can believe either, because the input and output relations for individuals are just different than they are for groups. We just don't display the same functions that groups do. So the things that we believe and the things that groups believe, if anything, have to be totally disjoint, because we don't display the same functions. Now, I still think that groups and individuals can know the same propositions. And the reason to think that groups and individuals can both know the same propositions is that otherwise we can't make sense of at least some cases of deception. So let me give you an example. Darla is cheating on her taxes, and she takes steps to hide it. The reason she takes steps to hide it is because she doesn't want to get charged with tax evasion. So she tries to hide it from the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service. So for the non-Americans in my audience, this is the United States Tax Authority. So the IRS isn't going to charge her unless they've got good evidence that she's guilty. If they just suspect that she's guilty, they're not going to charge her. They might like pay closer attention to her tax returns, but no charges. So they need good evidence that she actually did it in order to at least, or to recommend that she be charged. So that is, given that she is guilty because she's cheating on her taxes, the IRS has to know that she's guilty in order for any tax evasion charges to be forthcoming. So what Darla is trying to do is she's trying to prevent the IRS from knowing that she's cheating on her taxes, not just believing it, right? But a belief is not sufficient to get her charged. She's trying to prevent them from knowing it. And so her actions wouldn't make sense unless the IRS could know that she's cheating on her taxes. So in order to make sense of Darla's deceptive behavior here, we have to think that groups really can know things. And in particular, really can know the same things that individuals can. Darla and the IRS can both know that she's cheating on her taxes. Now, that means that whatever relation S, a person, must bear to a proposition P in order for S to know that P has to be a relation that S can bear to it regardless of whether S is an individual or a group. And moreover, since groups and individuals cannot believe the same propositions, given that functionalism is true, this means that this relation, whatever it is, must not be the believes that relation. So since Darla and the IRS can both know that she's cheating on her taxes, and since the IRS cannot believe that she's cheating on her taxes, whatever relation you have to bear to a proposition in order to know that it's true can't be the relation of believing the proposition. So what relation is it? I'm going to suggest that it's the relation of being committed to it. And let me talk about that for a bit. Darla and the IRS can both know that she's cheating on her taxes, but only she can believe it. This is a proposition that's not available for the IRS to believe. But they can both endorse the proposition, and so they can both be committed to it. Both of them can say, yes, that's right, and we're going to stand behind it. We're going to take ourselves to be answerable for justifying this. If somebody doubts what we've said, we can take ourselves to be required to have evidence for its truth. Now, Darla, of course, is hiding the evidence, but she could endorse it. And so since they can both endorse it, they can both be committed to its truth. And arguably, this endorsement and commitment is what's important about the belief condition and knowledge anyways. So what matters epistemically is that you in some sense take, scare quotes around take, a proposition to be true. So in what sense do you have to take a proposition to be true? I don't think it has to be belief. I think that belief only matters because believing a proposition is one way of taking it to be true. When you believe a proposition, you commit yourself to it. You endorse it, at least most of the time, selfless asserters aside. So the belief condition on knowledge is important because you are, in ordinary cases, committed to and endorse all of the propositions you believe. And moreover, you believe and are committed to all of the propositions, you're committed to and endorse all the propositions that you believe in the ordinary case. There are exceptions, but in the ordinary case. And so the belief condition of knowledge is there because most of the time it doesn't make any difference whether you to talk about belief or endorsement or commitment, because in ordinary situations, they all come to the same thing. There are exceptional conditions. I mentioned selfless asserters, they're possibly one, and groups are another. So there are some cases where these do come apart. And where they come apart, it's that you take the proposition to be true in whatever sense that amounts to, not that you believe it. And since there are other ways to take it to be true, by endorsing it, say, it's not the psychological state that matters. It's the endorsement, the commitment, the normative force that comes with certain psychological states, I believe. And moreover, I have independent arguments that we should have a commitment condition on knowledge and not a belief condition. So let me shamelessly plug one of my own papers. In Knowledge Requires Commitment Instead of Belief, which I published in Phil Studies a couple of years ago, I have a different kind of argument suggesting that we should jettison the belief condition of knowledge and have a commitment condition instead. So, can groups and individuals commit themselves to the same propositions? The answer to this is yes. One common way to take up a commitment, not the only one, but a common way, is to assert it. And in particular, Deborah Tollefson argues that the commitment account of assertion, according to which what it is to assert a proposition is to take up a commitment to it, is what makes best sense of the phenomenon of group assertion. So it works better than expressive accounts of assertion, for instance. And if she's right about this, or even if she's just on the right track about this, then we've got a story about how it is that groups can take up a commitment to a proposition. They assert it. But how is it that they assert it? Well, they assert it through a spokesperson. And there's quite a literature on this by now. But the idea is that there's an authorized proxy, a spokesperson, who has been granted authority to say things on behalf of a group. And when the spokesperson speaks in their capacity as a spokesperson, it's not necessarily the case that they, the spokesperson, becomes responsible for the truth of what they've said. They don't necessarily pick up the commitment, but the group that they speak for does. So if the Acme Vitamin Company calls a press conference and sends their spokesperson up to the podium, and the spokesperson says, Acme vitamins are very healthy, whether or not the spokesperson, him or herself, has picked up that commitment, we can put aside for now, but the company sure has. It's through the actions of an individual that a group picks up a commitment. And that means that a group can be committed to anything that their spokesperson can express. So provided that the group has given the spokesperson authority to talk about some subject, anything they say about it is something that is a commitment that the group will acquire. Now, I'm going to assume that anything that's knowable is expressible. So I hereby, just by assumption, rule out mystical knowledge. And if anything that's knowable is expressible, that means that anything that a spokesperson can know, a group can be committed to. Spokespersons, of course, are individuals. And so anything that an individual can know, a group can be committed to, provided that the group has justification for it, and there's stories to tell about how groups get justification. It's going to mean that the group can know the same propositions that are expressible by the individual. And since what's expressible by the individual at least includes what's knowable by the individual, it's going to mean that anything that an individual can know, a group can know also. So that means that groups and individuals can know the same propositions, provided that knowledge requires commitment instead of belief, which it seems like it does. I've suggested that it does, and in the other paper, I have another argument for the same result: the knowledge requires commitment. And so one of the virtues of this way of thinking about epistemology is it allows us to look at individual knowledge and group knowledge as under the same umbrella. We can look at them. We don't have to draw any lines between the requirements for one kind of knowledge and the requirements for another. It's commitment in both cases. And we've got a story about how it is that groups can become committed to the same thing that individuals can. So that's it for now. Thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you at the Q&A session. The full paper is available on my website. It's at sites.google.com/site/Nick Tebben. You scroll all the way down to the bottom. It's under the unpublished papers. It's the last one down there. Feel free to take a look at it. I'd be happy to talk about it in the Q&A or any other time, really. So thanks very much. I do appreciate it. And I look forward to meeting you folks later on.